Catoctin Creek is a proud supporter of Bourbon Pursuit. At Catoctin Creek, they pride themselves on making traditional rye whiskey as it would have been made in the 1800s. Virginia grain, Virginia water, Virginia barrels. Catoctin Creek, the Virginia rye whiskey. This is brought to you by Smooth Ambler, a proud member of the Bourbon Pursuit family. Smooth Ambler builds on the traditional roots of American whiskey through innovative blends, proudly sourced whiskeys, and a unique line of their own homemade bourbon and rye recipes made in West Virginia. So venture off the traditional trail and go see them in Maxwellton, West Virginia. They'd love to welcome you to the family that they're building around their whiskey. Wilderness Trail is sweet mash Kentucky straight bourbon and rye whiskey, made by master distiller Shane Baker and fermentation expert Dr. Pat Heist. Whether it is high rye or wheated, cask strength or bottled and bond, Wilderness Trail is always non-chill filtered premium whiskey with unparalleled flavor. Distilled, aged, and bottled in Danville, Kentucky.
Now,
Everybody thinks I'm crazy that I grew up around Bardstown. They're like, what are you trying to sell New York bourbon in Tennessee? What the
Hey, it's episode 327 of Bourbon Pursuit, the podcast featuring news, reviews, and interviews with people making the bourbon whiskey industry happen. We're now on our final episode in our 4-part series of Is Bourbon Broken, based on the multi-part blog series from Bourbon and Banter. We've looked at the consumer, we've looked at the secondary market, and we also looked at distribution and retail, but this time we're going back to part 1 and revisiting the consumer, but at a slightly different angle, because we're going to start evaluating the purchasing trend of consumers. Now, don't get me wrong, bourbon and marketing, they really go hand in hand. And because behind every great bottle is an even better story, and that story is the catalyst that sells the bottle. The market is changing, and there are now more craft distilleries than ever. There's younger age statements, and there's non-distilling producers that are putting out products that are like 10 times the price tag of what it really cost the original producer. So what continues to drive this consuming and this purchasing behavior? Well, we'll dig into that here shortly. Enjoyed this week's episode, and now here's Fred Minnick with Above the Char.
I'm Fred Minnick, and this is Above the Char. This week's idea comes from Bill Webb, who writes me on Twitter, is it wise to use a bottle spout when pouring for tastings? Wouldn't that be the way to control the amount poured in case a person tasting didn't care for the spirit poured? Lastly, would a person be looked down upon for finishing everyone's leftovers of a tasting? Listen, Bill, you can't go and slurp up your buddy's drink after they've put their greasy lips around the rim and gotten their saliva all up in there. I mean, Bill, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and no matter your opinion on that stuff, it's never a good idea to be drinking after somebody, even if there's alcohol involved. In terms of the spout, that is really used to control pouring at bars. I hate them because most of them don't fit on the bourbon bottles that you would see at a nice party. Like getting a spout to fit on an Elijah Craig bottle is very difficult. Like the opening of an Elijah Craig bottle, you have to have a special spout. So no, I am not for spouts. If you want to have even pours, use a metal shot glass or something like that. But yeah, no, don't use one of those things. I'm very much against them. But that's going to do it for this week's Above the Char. Hey, if you have an idea like Bill, who I suspect is going to ignore my comments and go drink everyone else's bourbon, hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, or go to fredminnick.com and write me with your Above the Char idea. Until next week, cheers.
Barrel Bourbon has a single barrel program with rotating stocks of bourbon, rye, and rum. Talk to your local retailer about picking your very own barrel. Learn more at barrelbourbon.com. Welcome back, everybody, to this 4th installment of Is Bourbon Broken on Bourbon Pursuit, the official podcast of bourbon. Kenny, Ryan, and Fred all here once again to dive into this 4th part, and credit of this series on Is Bourbon Broken goes to Brent Joseph, who's a contributing writer to Bourbon and Banter. Over this 4-part series, we have evaluated Brent's opinion piece on Is Bourbon Broken? And we add our own commentary to expand further on where we see bourbon trending. In part 4 of Is Bourbon Broken series, we will talk about the one final argument, and that is looking at the consumer once again. In Brent's 4th article, we revisit the consumer problem, and he alludes that consumers are continuing to pay ridiculous prices at retail for bottles of extremely young or source bourbon from a myriad of new brands. He points the fingers to places like Blue Run for selling $150 13-year-old source bourbon, and at craft distillers for selling 2-year-old bourbon for greater than $50, when there's heritage distilleries selling their regular products, which have higher age statements and lower prices. Brent worries that this trend will not stop, and in the words, or should I say in his words, some of you continue to pay double for stuff that is just not good. However, the bourbon community has a chance to stop it, and he says, if customers don't buy overpriced product, the product either goes away or the pricing comes back to reality. So, there's no question that there's a few things happening. First is that there's probably more choice now than ever as a consumer. And second, the envelope is continually being pushed in regards to pricing. So on the first part, as people in the whiskey media, we pay attention to everything that's happening in the bourbon world. Are we seeing an overabundance of options on the market, or Fred, do you think it's just in line with the times?
It's in line with the times, and if a distiller's coming out and they're $20, they're not going to sell. Because I'm in Total Wine the other day, and there's this guy just kind of looking at the shelf, and some of the attendants and I start talking, and he wants our opinion on what to get. And one of the things that came up is like, well, that's just a little too cheap. I don't think I want to get that. He paid $60 for something because that was the amount of money he was going to buy, or that was the amount of money he was going to spend. And it did not matter that what we were recommending was $40 less and better than that $60 product. I mean, I think in the whiskey media, we communicate to people in a bubble. I think people that we are communicating to, and the Bourbon and Banter, people who read that, I think that we think very differently than that gentleman who is walking into a store who is a consumer of bourbon, but is not a consumer of bourbon media. And I just think,
or would you consider him an enthusiast? Maybe.
Yeah. This guy spends a lot of money according to the people there, and they just have something in their mind. And I've seen this play out time and time again. People have it in their mind that something that's more expensive is better, and that mentality is hard to get people to break away from. And like the brands have to price themselves where they get purchased. That's the truth of it. And so these new brands that are coming out, they're new and they're shiny, and people want something different. And Blue Run is a very similar run to 15 other bottles on the shelf, but they're priced at a premium, and they're getting a very different look than a lot of people, to include like that gentleman yesterday. So I mean, this is a real problem, and I think of all the things that we have talked about, it's the one that we can't solve.
Well, I feel like if you want bourbon to be broken, then you stop buying all this stuff. Because I think if you want bourbon to continue to flourish and to continue to grow, then people are gonna have to embrace these products, these higher age statement, higher price points, because that's help paving the way for the future of this hobby. It's you can't. $20 a bottle is, back when stuff was priced, no one gave a shit about bourbon. That's why it was priced that way. People give a shit now. And, and we got to embrace that. And if we want to keep moving forward, we're going to have to keep investing and keep buying stuff. So if we just stop and saying, we're just not going to buy this stuff, but I don't know.
And it's like also how bourbon was built. Bourbon was not built to compete with Scotch. It was built to be more of an everyday pour. It was built to be something that, a farmer could drink, or a doctor could drink, or a plumber, or a mechanical engineer. I mean, this is supposed to be the category for all people, and for people where value is more important than luxury. And that's how it was built. And now that is, skewing more toward the luxury side, you have this enormous gap of, under $30 products to the 60 and above. And every year, the mark of what is value goes up. I mean, I remember writing stories when the mark of value was $15, then it was 20, then it was 25, and now, I mean, if I'm not saying something is $60 is a value, then there are people who are like, man, that's a really good value, and it's like you can see like the consumer is changing. It's changing.
Like $75 used to be like, oh boy,
That's a lot.
This is a lot of money. And now I'm like, if it's under 75, I'm like, that's a great deal.
What am I waiting for? I'll take 3. And that's kind of what goes back to when we were originally doing our whiskey quickies. We were trying to figure out, how do we judge all this sort of stuff? And there's a lot of people out there, and they put a weight on the value or the price of it and where it regards and stands to them. And we decided early on and said, we're not going to put any weight on the price of the bourbon. We're going to judge it on the whiskey in itself, because what's $20 is a value to one person, $200 is to somebody else. And it's hard to figure out and say, oh yeah, for us, this is where it's at. Like, it's got to be a solid $50 bottle. If it's a $500 bottle and it's some of the best stuff you've ever tasted, is that a value? I don't know. The whiskey's just damn good. Like, that's what it kind of boiled down to. And so, Ryan, I posted it, Fred, but I kind of posted to you too. I mean, do you think that what we see on the shelves, I mean, you can go to Total, you can go to any of the large liquor stores, and you can see like the bourbon aisle just goes, like it doesn't stop going. And there is an abundance. Do you think that is in line with the times, or do you think that there's just too much out right now?
No, I think it's in line with the times. I mean, people are thirsty and hungry for, they've had the, so-called value brands, and those are all great. And it is hard to argue that, a Knob Creek 10-year-old or a Four Roses small batch, or, those Russells that are, priced at $40, $50, $30, that they're not better than some of these. But it's a hobby that there's so much flavor difference out there, and you can search and find so much nuance and differences and different things about all these brands. And it's you got to have that people want that. We do it. I mean, look at your bar. I mean, it's I've had this discussion with people. I'm like, vodka drinkers or tequila drinkers, they're typically like, I'm going to buy my Tito's, or I'm going to buy El Humidor, or a rum is like, I'm going to buy this. Not with bourbon. Probably, I would love to see how many average bottles a bourbon drinker has. It's got to be north of 10, and that's pretty crazy,
Even someone who doesn't consider themselves bourbon enthusiasts. Yeah, like I met with the lawyer the other day, and we were talking about like what he has in his collection. He's like, yeah, I'm not much of a bourbon drinker. He named off 12 products that he has on his shelf. 12.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, I'm not really much of a bourbon drinker.
And like, yes, there's a lot of bad product out there, a lot of bad offerings, but I'm still interested to try them. I'm like, it's like, ooh, what's going on with this brand? What's that? I'm interested. And like, I think as people get into this hobby, we all started there where we're like, oh yeah, $20 Weller 12 was, everyday thing. But well, we can't find that, but you kind of get bored with that, and you're always just looking for new, better things, different flavors. And you see it in wine too. You have your like staples that you're like, yeah, this is good, but what's that? And you're always trying to like push the envelope.
Having like having cut my teeth on wine, the wine industry is so very different. They actually took a cue from the spirits industry, like going toward like branding. Silver Oak is a good example. Prisoner is a good example. But wine was always about region, and so it was either French or Italian, and then it would be broken down. Tuscany, or France, like Bordeaux, Burgundy, things like that. And so these things would always be, broken down. And now it's more on the branding side, and that is the next evolution for bourbon. So bourbon is kind of like going more toward what wine used to be, and you're starting to see like a lot of geographical changes in a lot of different styles, and you all are part of that. 20 years ago, if a brand tried to put a blend of straights on the shelf, they'd have been laughed out of a liquor store.
From 3 different states, yeah.
Yeah. And then now...
Everybody thinks I'm crazy that I grew up around Bardstown. They're like, what are you trying to sell, New York bourbon in Tennessee? What the...
And now that's all in vogue. So that's the kind of like the trend, and that's an exciting part for me, is the new styles that we are seeing. They're actually not new styles. They've been in the books, but no one's played around with them. Barrel's great at it. High West is great at it. You guys are playing around in it. You're starting to see brands like Oregon Spirit kind of come out with products that 5-10 years ago never would have given the time of day, and now they're like, they're bringing the heat. And so that part is very, very exciting. And when you start seeing that kind of spread out, and you see the competition, kind of even out a little bit, I think, and I'm not an economics guy, I'm not an economics professor, but I think that what you will see is that you will see like we're eventually going to hit a price point that is it's going to hit, and then everything's going to kind of revolve around that. And it used to be like Maker's Mark was the price point, and then it was like Woodford Reserve were the two price points that you wanted to be in between or around, like when you were starting a new brand. And like now it's just kind of like an entire shelf. So I mean, I don't know. I don't know when that ceiling is going to hit, but it is fascinating to just observe a liquor store shelf from month to month to month to month. It's fascinating.
See how it rotates.
And like bourbon drinkers, to me, along with like wine drinkers, it's not, bourbon drinking. Yeah, while yes, we like to have fun, but it's an experience. I want to show off and find those new brands, those new flavors. Be like, oh, you haven't had this? Try that. Yeah, of course you've tried Knob Creek before. It's great, but what about this? And it's just this whole experience. I don't know. That's the mindset I think a bourbon drinker gets.
Yeah.
And I think you look at it from a craft point of view where you can try to find a lot of those different nuanced flavors at younger ages, because there's a lot of good craft whiskey that's coming out at 4 years old. And I think we've already said it before that in the next 2 to 4 years, I think we will see a huge surge of really good craft whiskey that's been on the scenes, because now it's finally starting to age. I think one of my things I look at is that, Ryan, to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier, is that you have all these brands that have been out there and that you've tried. And we know that a few years ago that there was a lot of people that got on the MGP, and people were trying a lot of MGP, and they found out they really liked 13-year MGP and older than that, and completely wiped out the market on what was available out there. And so now we see brands having to readapt themselves and saying, okay, now we've got to sell 3-year or 5-year MGP to kind of stay afloat. I am concerned, and kind of goes back to the consumer problem, is that why are consumers, and this is like, I think OKI is a very good example of this. OKI was originally 11 to almost 14. I think they came out with a 15-year-old bourbon at some point, and now they push 4 and 5-year-old MGP. Yet consumers are going crazy for it.
We're talking post new riff sale.
Yeah, post new riff sale, right? Yeah. So now they're starting to put out, 4 or 5-year-old MGP, 36%. It's literally just the same, I guess you say the same exact stuff, just, 10 years difference or 11 year, you do the math there. But why are consumers still going towards brands that are still pushing younger age?
It's the story. It's the brand behind it. They're like, this is the,
But it's not even the same people, though.
It isn't, but people still have that like memory of it. Or I kind of try to wrap my head around this too, and especially with like Smoke Wagon, because I'm like, what is the craze about this? It's 5 to 6 year MGP. Like I just don't understand it. But then you try it and you realize, wow, he's pretty good at blending it, and it's got some good flavors that I'm not used to with
he's also like contract distilling, and and he gets a little bit of pick of the litter too, and like it is not always the same. There are like some little differences here and there with some of these MGP brands, but going back to the pricing thing, another company that does like some MGP sourcing, Old Elk is a very affordable price point. And I think, when I think of brands that I really like what they're doing, that's one of them, and they're in that $40 to $60 price point. They're not over gouging, and the whiskey is usually very, very good.
Yeah. But I liked how they kind of pivot, like, and kind of focused on like, not just the standard MGP.
Yeah. They weren't just taking 36%.
Like they made their own, and then they really nailed it with the wheat whiskey for me.
Exactly.
That stuff's fantastic. If you've never had their wheated product, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think Old Elk is like crushing it, and I think of like the new brands we talk about, and they're coming out. I'm like, that's one of the really good ones, and of course, that's got the former master distiller Greg Metz behind it. But this comes up, and Chris Hart brought this up in social media not too long ago about like if you're a brand like and you've got 3 to 5 year old juice that you're coming out with, and you're pricing it at X, just stop. And it's like, I always look at, like, people make business decisions based on their margins and what they need. It's a risk that you take with however you price it, because the consumers will react to it. And if you don't have something that's special that warrants the $100 price point or whatever it is, don't expect to sell another bottle.
Yeah, and there's a difference too, but it's like, who's behind the brand, who's doing the blending, who's doing because there's a lot of people just trying to capitalize on the bourbon boom, and they're just like, oh, we'll buy some source product, throw a label on it, throw it out there, and $150 price tag. And I'm not sure who's behind the OK. I can't remember, but
I forget who it was sold off to as well. But
like Blue Run, for example, at first you're like, well, I mean, it's just Barton, it's like another Barton source product. But then you try it and you're like, man, somebody did some really good blending or good picking of single barrels here, because it's Barton, but it's an elevated Barton. So you got to look at who's behind it. But a lot of everyday consumers aren't going to look at that, and so they're just looking at that price tag and they're like, oh, $50, $60, that must be better than the the other lower price pointed products. So.
And they also came out at a time when, if you think about it, today's market, putting a big 13 on the label, that means something.
Yeah, because there's not many aged products out there. 5
years ago, you'd have been like, 13-year-old whiskey's everywhere. Like, what are you trying to prove here? Today, it's really hard to find a lot of those, anything that's double digits. So you start looking at it and say, okay, well, now if you were to start a brand and you have those double digits, it means something to a consumer. They see that.
I can't tell me how many bottles of Calumet I see at, like, just friends and families, and and it's all age stated, and you're like, I was like, I didn't know anybody bought these, but it makes sense because they're like, it's 12 years old, it's got to be good, right? And you're like, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, Calumet's an interesting one. That was one that I was really against for a long time. From a flavor perspective.
I was going to say, I'm curious why here.
Not them as people, but it was just
you
like...
just don't like their horses? Is that what it
Well, I just never tasted one that really did it for me. And then I tasted one of the releases that was really good. Then I got their 15-year-old one recently, and it was a 15-year-old for $109. I bought it at Costco, and I was like, oh, this is good. And they were pricing it pretty good. $100 for a 15-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon, that's solid.
Yeah, there's other ones charging $1,500 for it.
Yes, there's definitely some price hikes in that area. So, I think Calumet, they've been doing it for a while, and and I think they're starting to get some of the choice barrels because they've been doing it so long. And that therein is really where everything lies. It's like the people who have relationships and can get the good stuff, kind of like Aaron from Smoke Wagon, Calumet, people who can get those sweet barrels, those are the ones who are going to hit.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about this already, that anything in the source world, it's always going to come with a higher price tag. And there's just no way around it, because if you're not distilling it, or you aren't contract distilling it, starting it from the very start, it's really hard to kind of keep those numbers low. However, we know that if you have a story in a package, then it's likely to sell. So as a bourbon enthusiast, many of us know, as we talked about earlier, Blue Run. We know exactly where it's sourced from, but we still want to try it anyway. It's like, we don't want to just say like, we've had that before. We're still intrigued by it. We still want to try it. Is it just something that's in our psyche as bourbon enthusiasts, that we just can't stop ourselves from trying something new that may not actually be new? Spirits of French Lick pays tribute to the many distilleries that once dotted the southern hills of Indiana. They focus on using the best practices of those early times in balance with the improved methods of today, delivering the finest handcrafted bottled and bond bourbons to an audience that's eager for an alternative to the big guys. Their distilling philosophy is balance between the distiller's art and the contribution of the barrel, time, and patience to bring you an unparalleled quality and depth of flavor. Spirits of French Lick's motto is simple: respect the grain. You can find all Spirits of French Lick's products and their new releases on sealbox.com. But don't just take Fred Minnick's word for it. Find out for yourself. And check out spiritsofFrenchlick.com and follow them on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to always drink responsibly. Savor every drop of summer at Total Wine & More, because they've got a sizzling lineup of pours for the great outdoors. Get ready for the holiday weekend with their top 12 wines under $15. And beat the heat with refreshing bourbon cocktails. So why not serve a brown derby made with bourbon, grapefruit, and honey at your next barbecue? Then taste your way to a new favorite. With over 500 bourbons, Total Wine & More is the place for whiskey lovers. Looking for something new? Well, check out McFarland's Reserve Kentucky Straight Bourbon. Extra wheat in the mash bill makes it especially smooth. You're sure to find cool prices on over 8,000 wines, 4,000 spirits, and 2,500 beers in-store or at TotalWine.com. The Heaven Hill Bourbon Experience underwent an expansion, renovation, and renaming as a culmination of a multi-year $19 million investment in Kentucky's signature industry and a model for the future of tourism. The state-of-the-art Visitor Center is an interactive, educational space offering signature exhibits unique to the Visitor Center, including a You Do Bourbon Experience, where guests are guided through a tasting of unique products. And to commemorate your visit, you'll have the opportunity to bottle your favorite bourbon or whiskey through the custom-designed filling machines, and then you can apply the label and personalize it in the bottling room. To learn more about bourbon, Heaven Hill's history, and their award-winning portfolio, go to heavenhilldistillery.com/booking to schedule a tour. Heaven Hill reminds you to think wisely, drink wisely. Cheers. Is it just something that's in our psyche as bourbon enthusiasts that we just can't stop ourselves from trying something new that may not actually be new?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I like, you know me, I like to try everything. It's like, how could this batch of Barton be different than that batch of Barton? But it is sometimes, you know, and
we do those single barrel picks,
yeah,
and we see them side by side.
It's that, and that's the exciting part, and that's why I've always said bourbon is the perfect product, because it's so hard to replicate. You can replicate it, but you have to do it in big scale. But you can find nuances on a small scale, and that's what's so fascinating about it, is that you can take a product that's an everyday product and have a completely different profile, because you can pick barrels that are from this part of the warehouse that taste completely different from that part of the warehouse. And that's what's fascinating about it all. And that's what keeps you interested, because you're like, what if this is the secret batch? What if this is the one?
Remember, you always
that's going to win San Francisco.
You always talk about
Ascot Awards.
Those special barrels, right?
Yeah.
You always talk about that.
But then you walk into a Rick House and you're like, oh, it's just another bottle of whiskey. Why am I getting so freaked out about it? But I can't help myself. I still fall sucker to it every time.
Yeah, and I'm always amazed too when I haven't seen a bottle before, you know, and then so it's like I got to find out what this bottle is all about, you know, who's making this, where's it from, who's the owner, you know, and usually if I don't know the person, there, you know, there's a degree of separation, but it's just kind of fun. You know, this is, as much as it is how I make my living, it's also like a hobby, like collecting baseball cards, of just like, even if I don't buy the card, I want to read the player statistics and I want to see the photo, what year it is and everything. So I think there's something to be said for that. And what I don't get excited about are like the Woodford Reserve, like Derby bottles, you know, that, because there's nothing different in that. It's just a Derby bottle. I'll look at the art, but I won't buy it. I'll appreciate it. But if it was a 12-year-old Woodford Reserve in there, I'd be freaking buying that all day long. But it's not. So I get really excited about finding the source of these things. That's my fun part. And you got to remember, like my book Bourbon Curious, when that came out in 2015, nobody talked about where they got their product from. Nobody disclosed their mash bills. And I disclosed all of that stuff for everybody. And now like there's like a bigger voice of transparency, and that's absolutely amazing. And you pick up some bottles, they'll have mash bills on there. And it'll say this is sourced and it's stored at this warehouse and this. I mean, I just get all excited seeing like the level of detail on labels. And I don't think that had anything to do with anything in this conversation. But
well, no, I mean, I think it goes to what you're also saying, is that when we look at it from a consumer point of view, and if you look at it from actually a distiller's point of view, is that bourbon is very malleable in the fact that we could take a barrel and you can bottle it, but if you proof it at 85 versus 90 versus 95 versus 100 versus 110, I just named off 6 different product lines right there.
No. I know you gave
that's
Weller's. That's Weller's business model, Heaven Hill's business model, you know, and
And you do that. You put it in a different part of the warehouse. You buy barrels from New York. You age them in Memphis for a year. It's a completely different product. And that is something that I think as a bourbon consumer, bourbon enthusiast, we have a story behind these, but at the same exact time, bourbon changes. It changes very easily. And so when you think of, I think I've tried everything out there, I don't think you have. There's going to be no end in sight for when you could say that, oh, I've tried this before, because odds are that batch is different from this batch. This is a little bit different proof than this proof. This was, this had, sun shining down on it for 3 hours a day versus that one had 9 hours a day.
This one's now has it's aged in glass. But it is crazy if you go to like any website to find like mash bills and you look at all the Kentucky mash bills, they got to be within 5 to 10 points of each other on each mash bill, 70 to 80% for the first number, 10 to 15 on the second, and then 0 to 3 on the third. It's like that they're all pretty similar. So, but there's just so, like you said, it's very malleable. There's so much change in the product in different places, and it's wild.
Yeah, there's a lot of play. So I want to also touch on Brent's comment of some of you continue to pay double for stuff that is just not good. And I think if bourbon has taught me anything so far is that no one can agree on anything. And bourbon is so polarizing that everyone can have their own opinion, and it's on taste, and it probably won't matter unless Fred Minnick puts out a bad review on it. So when we think about this...
Wait, you wrote that?
I wrote that.
No.
I wrote that. He didn't
I was going to say, I don't remember that.
But I mean, that it just kind of show that whether we come out with 18 different product lines, you're going to have people that like it, have people that don't like it. And it's just going to be, gosh, how many times we've talked about how the music you're listening to, what you had for lunch, how everything is going to change the way that you feel about a bourbon on that day, that it's hard for you to sit there and write something off on day one sometimes.
Yeah, and I try to tell people to taste for themselves as much as possible. Don't listen to me, don't listen to other critics. I mean, just use this as a guide, which I think we've all said on this show. And if you can't taste for yourself, decide for yourself, and you need other people to tell you. That's a dangerous way to spend money, because you're going to buy something eventually that you don't agree with.
But that's how the listicles get made. The top 10 bourbons for the dead heat of summer.
We could do an entire show.
But here's the thing: it's like they're all going to sell still. It's just a matter if they're going to get opened. Yeah. That's the thing, which is crazy about bourbon. Like people are still buying it. They just may or may not open it based on a review.
One of the best comments I ever got from a distiller was like, your bad reviews sell as much bourbon as your good reviews because people want to see if you're right. And I was like, that's a pretty good testimonial.
Yeah,
it is true. I'm always like, somebody's like, oh, this is bad. And I'm like, I want to try it.
I know, that's the whole reason why Malort's even around, that awful liqueur from Chicago.
It's got them
Cue the cough. Cue the cough. I mean, it's just couldn't have been better timing right there.
But also, I think at the end of the day, what people are paying additional money for, there's usually a good consensus that likes it. To each his own. Taste for yourself. And if you have that money and it doesn't hurt you to spend it, I would ask that you, if you see it and it's overpriced, maybe see if you can buy it somewhere else where it's not overpriced, because that therein is what pushes the equation further to hurting the the system.
Well, what is the context of the question?
Yeah, I think Brent's argument was to say that a craft distiller comes out with a 3-year-old product and they price it at $60.
Did they distill it?
Yes.
Okay, they got to make money. It's that simple. I mean, and $60 I think is a reasonable price for a craft distiller. Cannot be looked at in the same eyes as Jim Beam. You just can't do that. And I remember when Peerless came out and they were like $90, and man, they took it on the chin. Garrison Brothers, comes out a very high price point with their cowboy product. Took it on the chin. I was very vocal about them being too expensive and in comparison. But when someone else wants to put up $20 million to build a distillery, to hire people, to have, build warehouses and all that, and then I'm like, you get a say in how that particular product's priced. Now, whether or not, people are buying it, it's not a charity buy, but it's a small business buy. It's like the same reason why I'm going to a local shop to buy a candle instead of Hallmark, because I'm wanting to support a small business. It's why I'm spending more money on eggs at a farmer's markets, because I want to support the farmer. But it's that type of business strategy versus a strategy of winning over on the shelf from a value perspective. But
and I think people too need to start getting used to younger age whiskey. It's just going to be the norm because it's going to keep coming. Or the bourbon industry is just starting, and
then the old stocks are saturated.
Exactly, the old stocks are gone. They're gone, and it's going to take a while for that to catch up. And it's like, okay, I loved when Macaulay, with the Wilderness Trail was like, don't come here looking to taste a 10 to 12-year-old bourbon. That ain't what we got. But what we got is something pretty good at 4 to 5 years, and that's very true. Yeah, and it's like, what's your expectation? And it's like, and it's who's the people making this brand? If like patting them, I love them. I love supporting them. I want to see them grow and flourish. I want to buy a bottle to support them. It's like same with that craft distillery. If I go there and I meet the people behind it and see how hard they work, and the people and the story behind it, that makes me want to invest in them, and so we can taste their 10 to 12-year-old product. But there are brands that are just out there to make money on a boom, and they're not putting the passion and the hard work behind it. And that's where probably I have the problem with it. But there's a lot of good working, hardworking people that I want to support in this industry.
So back to the sort of pricing thing, and I know I can't be alone in this. We all get the same exact question, and it's whether it's Christmas time or a birthday, and they're like, oh, my dad, my mom, my friend, my boss, whatever. Can you give me a recommendation that's around $150? And I think about that, and I try to think. I'm like, gosh, there's only 3 or 4 brands that always come to mind. That's like Kentucky Owl, Foregate, maybe like Old Saint Nick from Preservation. But I think about this, and I'm like, okay, well, what they're coming out with, some of them are, they some source of products. Some of them have some larger age statements. Foregate does something that's very unique. Every single release is different. They do a bunch of finishing that justifies some of that price point. But I look at it, and I'm like, why aren't more distilleries or NDPs just coming out with another brand and just shoveling it at $150 and saying, there we go. Now we can hit this mark as well.
Come out on Black Friday.
Then we would have an entire conversation about, does the new wave of $150 bourbons mean bourbon is broken? I mean, it's...
But I mean, I look at it from a business perspective. Like, why not put out a few cases and just have another thing that's out there on the shelf?
I think because you got to be a long-term thinker. If you're just wanting to cash in short-term, yes. But if you're trying to build a brand that's going to be around for a long time, you have to create and add some type of value. Yes, you can cash in on that one time a year purchase for Christmas, but that's not going to sustain a brand. I see those bottles sit all year long until Christmas time or Derby time, and that's just not sustainable. If you're going to, it's hard to be just a premium brand only. I can't think of one that's just that, and that's all they are. I mean,
well, Pappy. I mean,
I know, but they have a whole line underneath them. That's damn, they went out of business, way back in the day. So, but they had a whole line underneath them. They had Cabin Still and Old Fitz and all this.
You were talking about in the Stitzeweller days, that is a frame of thinking. Like, if they're going to create something to put out, it better be damn good, And I look at something like, once you go past that $100 threshold, and we brought up Calumet earlier, that 15-year-old that they put out, man, it's good. And, Elijah Craig, 18-year-old, it's good. Although I missed the days when it was $35, but, it better be good, and it better have some age to it. And, no one's buying the Abraham Lincoln bottle, that's priced extraordinarily high.
I forgot about that.
Somebody must have bought it. I don't see them around anymore.
Oh, I still see them. Yeah, I still
do
see
you really? Okay.
I think the liquor stores are just they've just taken them down. They haven't sold. They just moved them in the back because they're embarrassed by them now.
That's a tough risk.
Just rotate them everywhere.
Well, I just, it is a difficult conversation with someone's like, hey, I've got $150 to spend, and you tell them you should spend $60 instead of.
It's a tough conversation to have. You're like, it's not to say I don't value your boss's work, but there's just no bourbons at $150 that I could say, yeah, go and get this one every day of the week.
Yeah, there's a huge discrepancy in value from that 60 to 150.
And they hate it when you mention a brand that they deem as not being high, like Knob Creek 12-year-old. Like, oh, well, but there's regular Knob Creek. And, they just, I don't know. There's just something about like packaging of some brands that just wows people, and it just, I think that might be the issue. Is just like put the same stuff in a bottle that is like slender and has the Van Winkle feel, and then be done with it. I don't know.
A cognac bottle. So they're trying to say that's what sells.
The cognac or the wine bottle, and just
or even or Whistle Pig's bottle. Like Whistle Pig, Whistle Pig to me is like one of the most fascinating brands because right now it's outselling like a lot of the core products at major auctions. They're allocated. They're getting like deals with like major musicians. I mean, they're on fire. And they bought up all the Alberta rye that was left. They bought like 600-700 barrels of some of the lock, stock, and barrel kind of rye from Alberta. They're just like crushing it. And so I look at like a brand like Whistle Pig, and I'm like, how did they escape like all the criticism? And is it just because as simple as like they are not bourbon and they're rye? Is it that simple?
Might be.
But Willet escaped it too. It's like they somehow.
Oh no! Willet did not escape. They're the fan clubs carried him, but believe me, Willet gets plenty of criticism. People just aren't as vocal about it because they still want to try and get a barrel from Drew.
Quiet. Everybody, don't say anything about it. Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. It is true. We've always said that Willet is one of those brands that it gets a pass. It always gets a pass. People tend to overlook it, whether because it's a source product or whether they continue to release stuff at the gift shop for $1,500 a bottle.
And by God, they should get a pass because they
were one of the first to do it. Yeah,
they bought the stocks that nobody else wanted, and
they were smart enough to do it.
I tell people all the time, if it was not for Willet, if it was not for Evan Colesveen bottling cask strength older whiskeys, we wouldn't have a bourbon boom. Because he kind of like helped pave the way for people understanding what really great bourbon could taste like at cask strength. Oh, sure, Beam was doing it with Booker's as well, but Booker, I mean, it was brand centric.
Yeah, but it was a 6-year-old,
and he crushed it, and it was largely for the Japanese market. But if not for that man, saving those stocks, they would have been blended off in Evan Williams. They'd been blended off in Old Fitzgerald and been a bottom, $12 pour or $12 bottle. And, he saved them. And the premium movement of the 21st century, really the credit really does go to Willet and some of its offsprings like Michter's. When I say offsprings, like people that they bottled for.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess kind of one question to kind of look at this, and, Fred, you had alluded to Whistle Pig earlier. They came out with Boss Hog a few years ago, and that was what, $500?
That's right.
Like that?
Yep.
And that was Dave Pickerel saying, "Well, we're just not going to let the secondary market
exactly
take anything out of it."
Yeah.
So I don't see any of those bottles on the shelves anymore. They must have sold. So I'm assuming that whatever was out there is kind of gone. So do we see this as kind of an ever-going trend of pricing bourbon, where we could see, I just named off like, I need to buy something for my boss, and it's going to be $150. What's this going to be in 2 years from now, 3 years from now? I need to buy something for my boss. It's got to be $300. Is there going to be a bottle on the shelf always available that's $300, $400, $500, $1,000? What do we think the future of this is going to look like?
I mean, there is in cognac, there is in scotch, there is in all those other categories. You see them at Total Wine, you're like, who the hell buys that? But somebody does.
I mean, what Dixon came out with the Kentucky Owl, that was $1,000 bottle, right? I mean, something like that. And
I think, did that come out after Dixon though? After he left?
I think it
was before.
It was one of his last projects, but that was $1,000 bottle, and it sold.
Yeah, I think, and I think this is going to be a very unpopular opinion, but I think that this is where special blends can live. Like when we say bourbon, I'm thinking of the category. If you want to open that up to American whiskey, I think that this could be a very special place for some of the cool blends, like blend like a really old rye with a really old bourbon and something else maybe. I mean, there's a lot of room to play with here, but the packaging's also got to match the whiskey inside, and that is where like cognac, they're putting it in crystal. Baccarat and Woodford has that crystal, and you know what? That's coming up in auction, and I picked that as one of my favorite for the auction because my audience for the auction were art collectors, and they understand high-end crystal. So there's a little movement here, but it's got to come with the right packaging. It just can't be when we're talking $1,000, it's got to be the right packaging.
I guess I always try to compare, and maybe it's wrong, but I try to compare it to like wine. And I see people pay, they'll go to Jeff Ruby's and they'll pay $300 to $500 just for a bottle of wine that you get 4 drinks out of. And it's like, but I could buy a $500 bottle of bourbon and get like 20 drinks out of it, and it's like, to me, it just seems like a much better value. I have this expensive gift that I can last much longer than a bottle of wine, but I don't know. I don't know if it'll be like normal, but I think there'll be a lot more of that coming down the road.
And so kind of last point here is that we know that we've all seen the bourbon buying frenzy the past few years. And I don't feel like there's going to be a slowdown, and I don't feel like there's going to be a tipping point anytime soon. So I'm going to have to disagree with Brent when he said that if customers don't buy overpriced product, the product either goes away or the pricing comes back to reality. I believe what we have now is what it's going to be, and it's going to be here to stay for a while.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see how, there's a lot of people who think inflation's coming. I know that people drink in good economies and in bad. And if we have a bad economy, if we have, I think world factors play a bigger part in this than, bourbon guy going into a store and dropping 60 bones.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It just seems like there's so much more wealth in the U.S. than there was, just 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's like the baby boomers did such a great job at saving and retiring, and they're having these huge nest eggs, and then they're giving it to their children. And then there's just going to be this wealth that just keeps accumulating in the U.S. and they want to spend money, and they want to spend money on high-end items. And while there'll be, yes, good and bad times, I think there's just going to be always a premium market, and bourbon's trying to find that voice in there, with wine and scotch and Rolexes and whatever. I think it has found its place, and it's just trying to figure out how it used to be the bottom shelfer to now the top shelfer, and it's trying to find out where that balance is.
The journey of bourbon.
That's right.
From bottom to top shelf.
Drake sings about you.
Well, that's going to be our 5th episode is when we start talking about from the bottom to the top of bourbon. So.
Yep. Started from the bottom, now I'm here.
But this was a fantastic way to kind of conclude the series on Is Bourbon Broken, a 4-part series. So again, thank you, Brent Joseph, for writing that and giving us some really good thinking points to kind of talk about here. But with that, we'll kind of go ahead and wrap it up. Make sure you subscribe to Bourbon Pursuit and follow us wherever you get your podcast. Follow us on all the social media channels. And if you like what you hear, make sure you share with a friend and leave us a review. And also make sure you check out our good friend over here on YouTube, as well as his podcast, The Fred Minnick Show.
Woo.
With that, cheers, everybody. And we'll see you all next week.
Vodka 6.
Toodles.